Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us both live and those who will join us to listen as a podcast. Actually, lots of folks ask why we're doing it live and then upload it as a podcast instead of recording everything and then sharing as a podcast only. And personally, I just love this beautiful chaos of unfiltered live broadcast when anything can happen. And personally, that's my favorite way to go about this show as well. I don't know, Val. I know that it's stressful oftentimes, but also this is such a beautiful chaos in this,
Yeah.
in the way doing that.
And the other thing is that more people can listen to us because people who tune in on Twitter Spaces, I know that there's a lot of fans of Twitter Spaces as a means of communication in general, can listen to us and we can get our message out and educate and, bring things to the light to people here and in podcast if people want to do that in their own time. So I actually love both the chaos and the reach of doing both.
Yeah, and well, how have you been doing since the last time we tuned in?
Yeah, I mean, last time was days. Still confused with days, but last time was Monday. I think maybe this is something everyone is slowly starting to feel. It's been what now, 80 plus days?
It was one big day that
I know
won't fucking end.
It's true.
That's how I feel it.
I feel like things, it probably, I don't know, terrible to say, but things are like slowing down a bit and attention is like slowing down a bit and everything's, it feels like things are slowing down, which they aren't, because obviously it's very different for people who are like in Ukraine and in the middle of this, as opposed to like others like us who are maybe outside. But it just, I think, and you said this a little bit as well, but I'm feeling it too. It's just like having the time and this, like the fact that everything is slowing down is just making some feelings and thoughts settle in, and feeling just super tired and a little bit burnt out and not very creatively geared towards stopping everything right now. I don't know.
It's a similar shared feeling, naturally, of burnout. But my also question was why on Monday we haven't had a single word about Eurovision and Ukraine's much deserved, glorious victory, because on the merit of the song, but also because of this enormous wave of solidarity. And this is something that I keep coming back to it because it was such a nice moment, and I know that a lot it mattered, and I know that you even posted a bit of explanation on why Eurovision actually mattered, and that win was more than just a song contest. But
yeah,
for me personally, it was such a powerful reminder, because we usually and often mention the failure of a lot of Western and foreign governments when it comes to solidarity with Ukraine.
yeah.
And this is something that we vent our frustration oftentimes. But that night was a powerful reminder for me, and an illustration that there is a big difference between how regular people feel about Ukraine and how they manifest this strong solidarity, and there are governments that basically do such a crappy job at the same thing.
And the other thing, the reason I did the post that I did, I was getting loads of questions about like, oh, what's that instrument the guy is playing? What's that outfit the other person is wearing? And I read somewhere that like for culture to be appreciated and not appropriated, you need to explain it, and you need to like contextualize it, and you need to like make people understand why there are certain elements that are included, or so on and so forth. And I thought that was like, no one was doing it at that time, so it was quite interesting to I didn't know these things I wrote about, by the way, just FYI, research. And like Kvitka, who was here on our podcast earlier, helped me, because the Malanka, the two guys in costumes that were on the sides, I like could not figure out who they were for a very long time, but it was fun. It was a fun little research project.
Now I think we'll go to our featured Ukrainian. Sasha, hey, our ground rule that we do not introduce our featured Ukrainians and allow them to introduce themselves. So please tell us who you are, what you do, and how your life has been since the genocide started.
Thank you so much. I'm a little nervous. This is also my first time doing something like this. I'm very honored to have been invited here. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very excited to be here today. So thank you. My name is Sasha Boychenko. I am from Ukraine, from the city of Chernivtsi. I have been living in Portugal for the past couple of years, and I am a researcher at a European NGO called Victim Support Europe. And I also studied migration, which is kind of like a big general passion topic of my life. And recently founded my own NGO here in Lisbon, in Portugal, with a colleague of mine that is aimed at social inclusion of people with various backgrounds, including migrants. These have been some of the most difficult days, weeks, and months of my life, as I'm sure for every Ukrainian, really. It has been very difficult to be far away from home at this time. My parents remain at home in Chernivtsi, where they are, let's say, relatively safe within Ukraine, but it's not like there is a safe place there at the moment. So it's been very hard to live through this, and I've mostly kind of channeled my energy whenever I have it at raising awareness and communicating with English-speaking audiences, and also just helping Ukrainians who are arriving here in Portugal. So that's kind of what I've been up to recently.
That's amazing, and thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us as well, because I know every Ukrainian right now is extremely busy with doing a lot of things, from helping family to helping people in general, and doing, the work that you've been doing on your accounts. But I actually came across your account before the war kicked off, the full-scale invasion, not the war. Of course, it's been going on for quite some time now, but the latest iteration. And I remember that you, me, Yulia Tymoshenko, and a couple of others were, realized that there was so little content in English for foreign audiences about Ukraine before, that it was like a wave of stuff that started, appearing in terms of educational content. But I just wanted to ask you your sort of opinion or perspective, or like why back then. I think your post, I was just checking today, the most viral one that I sort of came across was the but why would Russia want to invade Ukraine?
Right.
I was just wondering what kind of pushed you to do that, and what motivated you, because it was, obviously back before everything became very
Right.
different.
Yeah, so things had been escalating for a while, and I was having conversations with people in which I realized that people kind of had very little knowledge about what was going on, which of course, on the one hand, it's normal, I think it's completely okay. It's impossible to keep up with every single thing that is going on in the world. We're constantly bombarded with a lot of information, and I have a lot of empathy for that. But I was very surprised to find out how little people actually knew, because for me, obviously, for someone who constantly revolves in these contexts, certain things just seem so obvious that I thought they didn't need explaining. And then I found out with great surprise that they did need explaining. And it was actually Yulia Tymoshenko, whom you've mentioned, who wrote a different but a similar post that went viral. And when I saw how much need there was for that, how great the reaction had been to that, I thought, well, I can also write down some of these like sort of basic thoughts at least. And I could not have imagined that it would get so much attention. It was, I do not have many followers on Instagram. This is not something that I do much or used to do much on social media. It was more targeted, I guess, at like my friends who are quite international, but still, you know, a friend group or like acquaintances, people I know. And I still felt like I was explaining some very obvious things, but the feedback I got was quite overwhelmingly positive, and people were thanking me for explaining things, and I felt a bit like, I don't know, it surprised me. It surprised me that there was a need for that. And then I thought, okay, well, at least I can be useful in this way, you know. And then I tried to do some more similar things afterwards. Although I just have to add that that post now seems extremely naive looking back at it. You know, I think I was still putting things very mildly, and we all learned just how much worse things actually were and were about to get.
But one of the things that I really appreciate about you and your existence and your explaining on that you do online is that when you look back at some of the posts that you did on Instagram in before the reinvasion, before February 24th, they are so still visionary in terms of that the things that you mentioned and the things that you explained are very still relevant to this day. And I pinned another tweet of yours that basically repackaged an Instagram post about how to talk to your Ukrainian friends. And most of the stuff that you mentioned there is still relevant, despite that you posted it, I think, sometime in January. And one of my favorite bits is that I would just, you know, mark forever: don't treat Ukrainians as your personal Google, which hilarious and so true. But yeah, it's still happening every day. But I wanted to do a quick follow-up on your explaining, because another feature about you that I really appreciate is that you also do explaining in other languages than English. So could you tell us about that a bit, but most of all, experience how it's different when you try to communicate these explainers to audiences that are not English speaking? Because as I suspect there is much more job to be done there than when it comes to English explaining.
Right. So the initial wave of basically that first post that got translated into many different languages, it was just this beautiful, spontaneous thing that happened. And it was basically people living, Ukrainians mostly, living in different countries, who reached out to me and were like, hey, could we translate your post? And I was like, yes, of course, please. And then later on, I also focused more on communicating in Portuguese because I live in Portugal and I luckily also speak Portuguese. And that, I have to say, that is much more difficult. It has been much more difficult for various reasons. So the most simple one, of course, is just like the language itself. I speak English better than I do Portuguese, but also kind of the audience with which you try to interact. And what I found out, to quite some surprise and sadness, is that the Russian propaganda has been wildly successful in Portugal, and no one really questioned it until recently. And people, just regular people who read regular newspapers, were subject to all this propaganda, and some ideas became very internalized in a regular Portuguese person's brain. And it can be very frustrating to have a conversation with someone who like genuinely believes, because they have read many times over the past 2 years in the newspapers that, you know, Ukraine is full of neo-Nazi training camps and that we have a civil war going on, and people just like reproduce these things, but in at least my like English speaking circles, those things had mostly been debunked, because there was so much work done to like counter all this disinformation. But in Portugal, it really all lagged quite behind. So
Yeah.
it's more frustrating, but I also think it's perhaps more impactful, which is why I still try to like not give up on that.
Yeah. And like partially I feel like there's been just much more investment into like countering some of these myths in English speaking countries, but not anywhere else. Like, we tend to forget that there's a lot of other languages and markets and audiences out there. And I think actually that the Kremlin machine, propaganda machine, has not forgotten that and has continued working across the world in different languages and has been quite successful. So that's super, super interesting. I guess my next question to you would be, it's just that, it will sound funny the way I was about to frame it, but at different points in time in the past couple of months, different things have annoyed us Ukrainians in terms of what we have been hearing and seeing in our outside circles, in our day-to-day life, or on the internet, or in the media. And I was just wondering your thoughts on like the latest thing you would like to call out from what you're hearing around the narrative around the war in Ukraine and Ukraine in general.
That is an excellent question, to which I perhaps don't have like a ready to go excellent answer. But I think so. The first thing that comes to mind is, I think that is not new, but that persistently keeps happening. And I think it's also fitting to mention it in this specific context with you here. That is, people keep having opinions about what Ukraine and Ukrainians should do and how we should act and what decisions we should make, both, like politically, militarily, and people inside Ukraine, but also people who have been forced to flee Ukraine, and also people like us who are Ukrainians and live outside of Ukraine. I think there's kind of a continuous, expectation on us. There's also, people just have opinions about how we should be or what we should do, and it doesn't seem to cease existing. And I never had a lot of patience for it, but I think especially now it just seems quite outdated at this point.
This is the very reason behind this initiative, this frustration that hasn't started 84 days ago, but has been going on for many decades, where a conversation about Ukraine that primarily still happening in many Western parts of the world keeps happening without Ukrainians being present at all. And for some people, this is a very natural thing to go about this thing. And sometimes I'm very perplexed about why it's even, considered okay thing to do. Because when people talk, especially in the West where all the identity issues are so sensitive, and people kind of learn to accept the fact that you cannot talk about the issues linked to some community without representation from that community, and it's not appropriate at all. But the same rule somehow is not still applied to Ukrainians, and you still can have an hour podcast explaining Ukraine where just like 2-3 Western people do that without a single contribution from Ukrainian. And this is really fucked up, people. Sasha, I wanted to ask you about something that when I looked at one of your posts on Instagram, about how we can center discussions about Ukraine through Ukrainian perspective. And this is something that we both talk and think about it here on Ukrainian Spaces a lot. But also something that we do not discuss very often is how the same conversation is happening within Ukraine and among Ukrainians. Basically, how Ukrainians discover their roots, reconnect with them, and even decolonize their own views of our history, our identity, of what is happening. Is it something that you've been also kind of curious recently, or maybe you have any personal story to share how your views have been changing and become decolonized in a way in the last 84 days?
Yes, absolutely. So I think I just want to mention that I think in general, decolonization usually follows some kind of similar patterns, right? Like there are certain things that you can usually point out, certain patterns, things that will happen. There are theories about it, you know. But I think what makes things much more complicated for us is we are still in a very active phase of war, and that is usually not the time when these reflections happen, but it's just kind of, it's a train and it's going, and so we have to do these processes kind of simultaneously. And I think a lot of people, including a lot of Ukrainians, are only now beginning to realize that colonialism is a lens to view Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries through. And I think that leads to a lot of difficulties, that creates a lot of confusion, and it's much less obvious than in some other cases where you look, at like traditional, let's say, a settler overseas colonies and colonizers, where it's like it's very clear that this is what's happening here. While here, I think both us and foreigners are only now kind of coming to terms with what's going on. What is important for me, but also in general, is that it's an ongoing process, right? So it's kind of an ongoing effort of looking at your own views, ideas, beliefs, values, and kind of reassessing them every once in a while, because we keep learning things. And I think we keep discovering that we have these things deeply rooted somewhere inside us, and it might not be very obvious. Like I was thinking earlier today that as I was thinking about our conversation, I was thinking that it's kind of like misogyny, that it's not something that you are immune to if you are in the oppressed group. Instead, it's something that you can carry inside you because society carries it inside you, and so you don't realize that you might have, let's say, using the example of misogyny, you might not realize that you have some misogynistic views, especially if you're a woman. You're like, well, I'm a woman, I cannot hate women. But in fact, it happens very often. These things are ingrained, and I think it's really important to kind of keep looking at it. And I would say for Ukrainians, for instance, certainly there is this kind of inferiority complex that has been cultivated in us for hundreds of years by Russia. And I think a lot of people are only now starting to realize, that we're cool.
Yeah.
So I think that's the internalized colonialism that we carry within ourselves.
One of my most favorite examples is my passport. I used to travel a lot, especially before the pandemic, but now as well. And one of the things that I've never understood, like why in every situation when I'm crossing a border at passport control, I was kind of hiding my passport, and I wasn't very comfortable, putting it out there so people see that this is a Ukrainian passport, I'm Ukrainian. And only recently I kind of realized that this is one of the manifestations of inferiority that was conditioned by Russian colonialism to generations of Ukrainians not being proud about who you are at all, even in these kind of weird random situations. So maybe you can share some of the examples how it manifests in your own life, this decolonization process that we're going through.
I went to Germany for my studies. I did my bachelor's at an international university in Germany, and I came there convinced that I was probably like one of the dumbest people who got in that year, because it's quite a prestigious university. There are people from international schools who had done their international exams and IBs and all that, and I came from school number 2 in Chernivtsi, and so I was sure that I was worse off than many people there. Some parts of that were true, at the beginning. Certainly some people could write a better essay than me, but I quickly discovered that when it came to, let's say, having a political discussion and holding views that are somewhat more complex or even opposing to each other at the same time, I did quite better. I think it can be very difficult for someone who has not had the experiences that most of Ukrainians have had to be able to hold ideas that don't all nicely align into one neat box together. And I think for me, that was a moment when I realized, coming from where I come from, it gives me an advantage for the way in which I see the world and the ideas that I'm able to like capture and hold in my mind at the same time.
Yeah. 100%. It's like that meme, what's your superpower? I'm Ukrainian. That's kind of the vibe we're all in.
Yes.
At the moment, I think. I also like, mine is related to our session that we had last week about language. For me, it's something, I don't know, like I realize, I fully acknowledge that the way that I feel about the language that I speak has so much to do with Russian like colonialism and imperialism, because and like you said, with misogyny and things like that, it's not that we're immune to that, as women, but it's something that we like acknowledge, and we need to work towards understanding and sort of expelling from our psyche. So for me, there's I still, up until this day, there's something with language, and sometimes I just don't, I don't know, I'm that's why I'm like, proactively, every single new Ukrainian person I meet, I either speak English or Ukrainian, because that's like my way of actively trying to fight against this, almost, I want to say, disease that's been unleashed on us by centuries of making us think that speaking Ukrainian made you less than everyone else. But thank you so much for your example as well.
And I think another powerful point from it that reminds me of something that we also mentioned before, that for a lot of Ukrainians, discovering their roots and discovering their history, even within a family, is kind of an everyday act of investigative journalism, because a lot of truths and a lot of facts were concealed, hidden, erased through decades and centuries. And this does not make any job of discovering your identity easy. And it's just, I remember it today very vividly when I start reading this report about Russians in Mariupol going through libraries, at least those that stay more or less intact, and taking out and destroying all textbooks on Ukrainian history, which is something that, again, is happening not for the first time in Ukrainian history, and Russians would do that through many iterations of Russian colonialism. But again, seeing it happening in 2022, it's kind of powerful reminder that multiple generations of Ukrainians lived through complete cultural, historical erasure through these simple acts of just, destroying books that would carry our ancestral truths and historical truths. And keeps happening today. It's completely mind-boggling why the world keeps allowing Russia to do that, not only with Ukraine, but with so many other nations, colonized nations as well. So yeah, Sasha, I wanted to maybe ask you a follow-up in terms of explaining, even within Ukraine, where do you feel like something that we're still lacking, some kind of a form of expression that the society lacks when it comes to the process of decolonization? Whether the problem may be that we know so little of our history sometimes, or maybe there's not enough outlets that do that kind of educational stuff. What do you think is something that we're really missing at the moment?
So I think that's a great question. Thank you. I think what you said about rediscovering our roots extends much broader, because it's not only that our history and identity have been systematically erased, they've also been altered. It's almost like they've been messed with. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, and I think we will keep kind of discovering new things that have to be deconstructed. What comes to mind to me now is also this division between the West and the East, the Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukraine, which I think has also been largely fabricated by Russia. And that is something that I didn't used to think about. In fact, that is something that I was a supporter of, not an active supporter of, but kind of a victim of, if I don't think that's a good word to use, but, I think I carried this idea as well. And I think, in fact, if you look a bit deeper, you realize that idea carries the same purpose as many Russian actions do, and that is division and destabilization of a place. And I think that idea has largely been put into our heads. So I think that's something that we will have to deal with. And then, sorry?
Yeah, no, something we'll have to keep working on for a very long time.
Yeah, because I think we now have also, despite the horror and despite the very exhausting fact that we have to do this now at the same time with the war still going on, I think we also have a unique opportunity to totally reimagine this. And you see the unity that we have, and you see the insane bravery of Ukrainians everywhere in Ukraine. And it gives a way, I think, for shaping a new identity that does not have this division in it at all. It's not even, I think, it's not even a component. It doesn't have to be there. And I think we have a chance to achieve that.
It's also going back to the post I made about Ukrainian culture and from Kalush, all the elements that they did. When I was putting it together and I was researching all of the different Bukovinsky Keptar and Hutsulski this and all these references from Western Ukraine, I had this thought for a second in my head being is this my culture, or am I or is this the Western Ukraine culture that I'm not part of? And then I was wait a second, it's Ukrainian culture.
This is exactly my point. Yeah, this is exactly my point. And I think these are things that did not just happen organically, I think these are things that, just like so many other purposeful actions, have had a purpose over decades and decades, to create this division, to create this lack of knowledge, to make sure that you don't identify with a different part of your country. And I think we have a good chance to overcome that right now.
Yeah. So this is a perfect bridge into my next question to you, which is our favorite question all the time. What do you think, and what does being Ukrainian mean to you? And what do you think being Ukrainian means more broadly, or should mean?
What has happened so far, and what I hope will continue to happen, is that being Ukrainian has been a really liberating and empowering experience, despite the horror that it has been as well. I think for me personally, I have been proud to be Ukrainian for a long time, but I was, I guess, privileged enough for some years for it to not have to be kind of like this central part of my identity. And now, I think for obvious reasons, for many of us, it kind of becomes the main thing. And I think there can be a lot of pressure associated with it. You know, I think as we speak about Ukrainian spaces and giving voices to Ukrainians or amplifying the existing voices of Ukrainians, I think there can be this pressure to perform, to represent all of Ukraine, to say something smart every time you open your mouth. And I think it doesn't have to be that way at all. You know, when you invited me here, I kind of got really nervous, and I was like, I don't know if I should accept this, you know, and will I have things to say? And then I thought, no, I will do this, because I think we get to at least enjoy this freedom right now, which is to be ourselves, to have our spaces, to talk freely, to explore who we are. And yes, we now have an audience, and that's good. We deserve one. We have smart things to say, but sometimes it doesn't have to be, you know, like, I don't know, Europeans or US Americans are saying stupid things on the internet all day, every day, and we can too. It's a bit weird. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's 100%. This like kind of liberation that I feel around it. If before I felt more of this pressure to represent and say something smart, now I feel like we just kind of get to be ourselves, and we get to figure out what that means for us.
Yeah,
it
100%.
probably also comes from the same colonialism conditioned inferiority complex, right?
Exactly.
When in every room, in every conversation, and God, I probably did like thousands of public talks by now, but every time I would feel a lot of pressure, because you kind of feel like you have to perform much better than anyone else, because for the simple reason that there are not so many of us are allowed to have those spaces. Not so many of us are allowed to claim those platforms. And when we have these rare chances to do, there's so much pressure on you, because I mean, you got to perform, and you got to like pack your message, because you will also not be allowed to talk indefinitely. You'll probably have much smaller space and much less of a time to convey your message than everyone else, just for the simple fact that you're Ukrainian, and your voice is less valued. And sure, I do hope so. This will change, because God, this is too much pressure all the time, even these days. But something that also is not being kind of addressed, and I think the terrific topic, even by Ukrainians, is everything that is revolved with Ukrainian partisan movement during World War II, and Bandera, and our war flag, black and red. And I know that it's very uncomfortable for many Ukrainians question to discuss, just for the simple issue that has been hijacked by Russian propaganda and is being used and abused against us. But also, maybe, I mean, feel free to pass on it, but maybe you have some ideas about how do you deal with questions like that were heavily hijacked by Russian propaganda and Russian colonial propaganda, and how do we effectively reclaim it and tell our truth and express what we want to express about our own history, even if, you know, for some reason it's not black and white.
Right. So it's not black and white. And I think what matters the most is that we have these conversations, because I think what has happened as a result of Russian propaganda and all of these events is that it's used as an instrument against us by people who have nothing to do with this and wouldn't have even known ever in their lives who Bandera was, but now they do, and they want to ask you, what do you think? And like, I think we don't owe answers to them. I think we owe answers to ourselves. Do we know our history? Do we know why OUN even had to exist? Were there Nazis in there? What were the choices that were made and why? And I think there, again, like I was saying before, it's not like we will always say something smart. It's very possible that people will not have the knowledge. My own knowledge of Ukrainian history should be a lot better than it is. And people will say things that are wrong or that are not the most intelligent things they've ever said. And I think it's totally fine and it's part of the process. But I think what's really important is making sure that this is kind of happening on our own terms. And I'm not sure how to do that practically without being rude to other people. But one thing that I found useful, like in general, is pointing out the reason why someone is asking that question. Like, are they actually genuinely curious about, let's say, an event in Ukraine or a party in Ukraine or a person in Ukraine and the complexities around it? Or did they read an article that said that we have Nazis in Ukraine? And if they did, then they have a lot of work to do and a lot more reading to do before we can continue that conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is very smart.
And also, like, as both you and Maksym, professional researchers, first thing you go to the source of wherever these things are coming from, which is great, and I think everyone should do. And the other thing is, like, let's turn this around on the people that ask us these things. Do they know as much as we do about, Nazis in their country and whatever else, and history and so on and so forth?
And who has funded their rising far-right parties in the last 30 years?
Exactly. I'm pretty sure it was in Ukraine. I think we have a couple more minutes left, and we have still some time with Sasha. But Sasha, what would you sort of like to, if there's another one point that you would like our audiences to go away with, sort of an education piece for the future on the war in Ukraine, what would you like them to remember from our conversation today? Sorry if that's too much of a open-ended question, but I'm sure there's something that's been also, like my question before, annoying you.
Let me. I have a cop-out. I read an article by Timothy Snyder today, a recent one that just came out in the New Yorker a couple of days ago. And it said that it's a very much historical article on the history of Ukraine and kind of explaining why this war is a colonial war. But it also said something that gave me pause, and it ties, I think, neatly with the things that we've discussed earlier today. And it said something like, if we are going to maintain democracies in the 21st century, we're going to have to accept the complexities that they come with. And I think it's a thought to keep in mind with regard to what we said about things being black and white and context mattering and listening to people who are at the source of the things happening.
Sasha, I wanted to wrap up to ask you a final question is about, because I know that you share very oftentimes causes for fundraising and pointed out to places where people can donate or amplify some fundraising calls. Is there something you would like to share, something that people should pay attention, or some platforms that they should definitely check out? So this is your opportunity to do that. Please do.
I have come to understand that kind of the more directly you can give right now, the better. So if you have friends, like people you know personally, and you see that they are fundraising, I would say donate if you can. Usually that help goes like directly where it's needed without the risk of like getting lost or going somewhere else or getting stuck with some bureaucracy. That was my experience with some of my own fundraisers, where things were bought, immediately, like while we were still raising money, and 24 hours later, they were already with the people. I was fundraising the other day for a thermal imaging camera for my uncle, and he has it. The unit received it yesterday, which was less than 24 hours after we finished the fundraising. And I think it's just very efficient. And I think
Your uncle
save
on the
life.
front line.
Sorry?
Your uncle on the front line.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. And I think save life, Povernись живым, is always a good idea as well. They are extremely efficient in the way they manage their money. I would say, yeah, generally, if you can give locally and directly, that would be my advice.
Thank you so much. It was super nice to have you here with us. Thank you once again for taking your time out to talk to us. I hope that everyone else here will follow you as well on Twitter and on Instagram, where Sasha does a lot of her work on educating audiences and fundraising, and that some of you will come back to listen to Ukrainian Spaces again. And Maksym, if you wanted to remind everyone once again about our Patreon and support.
Yeah, Sasha, дякую дуже тобі.
Дякую вам.
I wanted to remind everyone else about the podcast, that these broadcasts now recorded and being uploaded as podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts with the same name, Ukrainian Spaces, spelled together. And please also listen, subscribe, but most importantly, rate them. Rate them like there is no tomorrow, because this is how we make sure that Ukrainian voices trend online and in podcast platforms as well. And also, if you stan our shows, there is a simple way to support us, is through our Patreon space. You can become our sponsor. We're 100% independent volunteer effort run by 2 Ukrainians. So we do need any bit of support, no matter how small it is. And also, this is not a charity. You get a lot of bonus content in advance, but most importantly, you also get, for some of the tiers, front row seat when it comes to asking questions, whether indirectly or directly during the broadcast. So we always love and welcome our sponsors and Patreon fam to join our shows. Again, we'll talk soon. Stick around, use the hashtag Ukrainian Spaces to keep up with the show, but also share your experiences, especially if you're Ukrainian. And meanwhile, thank you so much, Sasha and Val, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Heroям slava. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.